In the great naval battles of the Second World War, people often remember the sleek destroyers, the mighty battleships, and the towering aircraft carriers. They remember the flash of naval guns, the roar of dive bombers, and the triumphant images of fleets racing across open water. What they almost never remember is the slow, awkward steel giant that made all of it possible. A vessel so plain that sailors joked it had been designed by a committee that never met in person. The Landing Ship Tank, or simply the LST. On paper, the LST was not impressive. It was long, flat, and blocky, with a wide, blunt bow that looked more like a barn door than the front end of a warship. It carried almost no heavy guns, its engines were underpowered, and its top speed barely reached 12 knots, slower than a destroyer running on one engine. It had no sleek lines, no polished decks, no sense of pride in its appearance. Even its crew laughed at it, calling it large slow target or long slow tow. And yet, within its steel walls lay the beating heart of the Allied amphibious war effort. Long before it earned that reputation, the LST was simply an idea, an answer to a desperate problem. The early years of the war had shown that landing troops on defended beaches was nearly impossible without a ship that could carry tanks directly onto shore, not onto barges, not offshore in deep water, but onto the sand itself. Tanks could not swim, artillery could not glide across waves, infantry could not run through surf against machine gun fire. Something was needed, something new, something radical. The British knew this well after the failures at Norway and the disasters of Dunkirk. Winston Churchill personally pushed for the creation of a ship that could carry armor across oceans and drive it straight onto enemy territory. The Americans knew it too, after studying the conditions they would face in Europe and the Pacific. The answer came in the form of a massive steel hull with a shallow draft, a reinforced bow door, and a long ramp that could drop onto any beach and deliver not only tanks, but trucks, jeeps, bulldozers, supplies, and hundreds of soldiers. The first time an LST slid into the water, shipbuilders stood amazed, not because it was beautiful, but because it was enormous, a floating barn capable of crossing the Atlantic. Yet what truly made the LST special was not its size, but its purpose. From the moment crews began training aboard them, they understood that this was not a glamorous vessel. This was a machine built for one job: carrying the weight of war forward. They slept beside tanks, smelled diesel and steel dust constantly, and endured long crossings in cramped quarters. But they also knew that every campaign, every hope of pushing back the Axis forces, depended on them. The early training patrols proved just how strange these ships were to operate. When fully loaded, the bow sat low, riding close to the waves. Crews joked that it felt like taking a warehouse to sea. The flat bottom meant rough seas tossed the ship fiercely, slamming the hull against waves hard enough to rattle teeth and knock sailors from their bunks. But despite all this abuse, the LST held firm. Its steel frame, braced by massive internal beams, cradled everything from bulldozers to Sherman tanks, and its hull, despite the pounding, remained strong. Sailors grew proud of the ship in a quiet way, not the pride that came from sleek design or deadly firepower, but the pride that came from reliability. The LST kept going even when thrown into storms that forced faster ships to turn back. It kept its cargo dry even when waves splashed across the deck. It delivered what mattered: men, fuel, weapons, and hope. In late 1942, in the final months of planning for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, the LST prepared for its first true test. The men of the invasion fleet studied their charts, looking at beaches they had never heard of and imagining the chaos of landing under fire. They wondered whether the LST could do what no ship had done before. They had trained opening the bow doors, lowering the ramp, and driving vehicles out in calm harbors, but the ocean was rarely calm in war. The night before the invasion, the sky over the Atlantic was black except for faint starlight. The decks of the LSTs were crowded with tanks chained to the steel floor, with vehicles packed so tightly that men squeezed sideways between them to move. Foreheads were damp from the engine heat below. The smell of fuel oil and sea salt mixed in a way that meant only one thing: soon the ship would drive itself onto an enemy shore. Some soldiers tried to sleep beneath their tanks, breathing shallowly in the metallic air. Others sat in small groups, speaking softly about what waited beyond the horizon. No one raised their voice. There was no swagger, no excitement, only quiet readiness. At dawn, the convoy approached the Moroccan coast. The air grew tense. Men stood on deck with rifles slung over their shoulders, while tank crews climbed into their machines, starting engines that echoed like thunder inside the steel belly of the ship. When land appeared as a dark line in the morning light, every man stared at it with a mixture of fear and determination. The captain gave the order, "Full ahead," and the LST began its slow, steady run toward the beach. As it drew closer, the ship shuddered when the keel touched sand. The bow climbed slightly, then settled. The ocean hissed against the hull. From inside the ship came a deep, metallic groan as the giant bow doors unlocked and began to swing open. Sea spray rushed in and sunlight pierced the dark interior, illuminating rows of tanks waiting like silent beasts. The ramp dropped onto the sand with a heavy thud. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the first tank rolled forward, its tracks clanking across steel and onto the beach. Soldiers followed, boots splashing into shallow surf, rifles ready to meet the unknown. The invasion of North Africa had begun, not with the roar of battleships, but with the quiet, unstoppable advance of a ship the world had overlooked. The LST had proven its purpose, and in doing so had opened the first door of the Allied return to the continents held by Axis forces. It was not beautiful, it was not fast, it was not famous, but from that moment forward, every invasion, every beachhead, every victory would begin with the unmistakable sound of its ramp crashing onto sand, a sound that meant an army had arrived and history was about to change.
Long before the beaches of Normandy or the black volcanic shores of Iwo Jima felt the heavy thunder of LST ramps crashing onto sand, there was North Africa. Operation Torch in November 1942, the first time these ungainly steel giants faced real war. The men who served aboard them did not know if the ships would succeed or fail. They only knew that thousands of lives and the entire Allied strategy of opening a new front depended on whether these floating warehouses could survive a hostile landing. The convoy approached North Africa under a moonless sky. The air was cool and sharp, filled with the smell of salt and burning diesel. The LSTs moved slowly in long lines, dark silhouettes against darker water. Their blunt bows cut through the waves with an awkward determination, never graceful, but always steady. On faster ships, men could feel the thrill of speed. On an LST, they felt only the persistent slow push forward, a rhythm like the heartbeat of a laborer bent to his task. In the tank deck below, the noise was constant. The engines thumped deep vibrations into the steel floor, and the air grew heavy from the heat of machinery packed above and below. Sherman tanks stood locked into rows, their barrels pointed toward the ramp as if already prepared for battle. The smell of oil, rubber, and metal filled the enclosed space. Soldiers slept sitting upright against tank treads, some with helmets still on because there was no room to lie down. Others wrote their last letters home, hoping to hand them off later if fate allowed. Some did not write at all, staring quietly ahead, gripping rifles as if bracing for the unknown. The LST was not built for comfort. It was built to deliver war. Even so, as the night passed into the early hours before dawn, the men aboard felt something deeper than fear forming between them and the ship. The LST held them, protected them, and carried machines of war across an ocean where storms alone could have destroyed lesser vessels. Its flat bottom slammed against waves with jarring force, but each slam was met with another forward push. The ship did not turn back. It kept going. At dawn, the African coastline appeared as a long dark smudge rising from the horizon. The faint orange glow of early morning framed the distant mountains and the empty beaches ahead. The sight stirred every man on deck. Murmurs spread through the ranks, whispering thoughts of what waited behind the dunes. Enemy fire, barbed wire trenches, or nothing at all. The uncertainty was worse than fear. The captain stepped onto the bridge, scanning the coast through binoculars. The radio crackled with coded messages from other ships in the invasion fleet. Transports, destroyers, battleships, forming their own patterns of movement. But the LST had a simpler purpose: go straight in, hit the beach, deliver everything inside. The order came over the intercom: stand by for landing, all hands to stations. In the tank deck, soldiers climbed into their Shermans, engines rumbling to life. Men strapped on gear, checked weapons, tightened straps on helmets. A few closed their eyes and whispered prayers. The ship shuddered as ballast tanks adjusted weight. The LST began creeping toward the shallow water. The shoreline expanded in their view, sand rippling under the morning light. Waves splashed against the hull, but the LST pushed forward, its keel grinding louder as it neared the beach. Then came the moment the crew trained for. The bow struck sand. A grinding thud echoed through the ship, followed by a slow settling tilt as the hull dug itself into the shore. They had made landfall. The massive bow doors began to open, the hinges squealed under strain, and the great steel plates swung outward, letting in a flood of bright sunlight. The tank deck illuminated, row upon row of armored vehicles ready to move. The ramp lowered slowly, touching the sand with a deep iron boom. For several long seconds, the world held its breath. Then a tank rumbled forward, its treads clanking down the ramp and into the surf. Water splashed against the hull as more vehicles followed. Soldiers shouted directions, guiding the heavy machines safely onto the beach. Behind them, infantry prepared to march forward through the smoke drifting from nearby naval bombardments. The entire shoreline came alive with movement. Engines roaring, boots splashing, waves rolling in and out, while more LSTs grounded themselves side by side, forming a chain of steel paths delivering war to the African coast. Operation Torch was underway. The LST had passed its first test. It had driven tanks and men directly onto a hostile shore, something no other ship in the Allied fleet could do with such speed or efficiency. Some LSTs took fire from French coastal guns, others were hit by stray shells, but the damage rarely kept them from completing their mission. Their hulls were thick, their compartments wide, their decks strong, and their crews were ready for anything. After the landing, men returned to the tank deck to find dents, scorches, and holes in the ship itself, marks of combat the LST had endured without hesitation. They touched the steel quietly, some with gratitude, some with disbelief that such an ungainly ship had delivered them to battle with such unstoppable resolve. As news spread across Allied command of how smoothly the LSTs performed, planners realized they now possessed something priceless. The LST could carry the war anywhere and land it anywhere. It could conquer beach lines that every nation before had considered impassable. It could turn the tide of an entire campaign, not through speed or elegance, but through raw capability. The soldiers and sailors who took part in Torch would later say the same thing. Nothing looked impressive about the LST until the moment its ramp hit sand. Then you understood. This ship changed everything. The invasion of North Africa had begun with doubt and uncertainty, but it ended with a quiet triumph. The LST had proven itself not just useful, but essential. And from that moment forward, every amphibious assault in the war would depend on the same unmistakable sound, the heavy steel ramp of an LST slamming down onto a new shore, marking the beginning of another step toward victory.
By the summer of 1943, the LST had already proven itself on the shores of North Africa. But the true test of this strange steel giant was only beginning. The Allied High Command now faced a chain of heavily defended coastlines stretching from Sicily to mainland Italy and eventually the fortress of Western Europe itself. To break through, they needed a ship that could do something no army in history had ever attempted: move an entire mechanized force straight from ocean to battlefield without pause, delay, or weakness. And only the LST could do it. Under the bright Mediterranean sun, dozens of LSTs gathered offshore of Sicily in July 1943, forming long lines that stretched across the horizon. They looked awkward and slow next to the sleek destroyers and the towering troop transports, but every commander present understood a simple truth: nothing could land without them. Inside each LST, tanks stood in perfect rows: Sherman tanks, medium tanks, bulldozers, self-propelled guns, each one chained to the steel deck to prevent them from shifting in rough seas. Above them, on the main deck, trucks, jeeps, fuel barrels, ammunition crates, and supplies were stacked so tightly that sailors could barely walk between them. Soldiers slept wherever there was room: on vehicle fenders, under trucks, against the steel bulkheads of the tank deck. The heat was oppressive. The air smelled of oil, rubber, salt, and sweat. Yet the men aboard knew they were sailing inside the single most important ship in the invasion. When the order to advance came, the LSTs lumbered toward the beaches of Sicily. The naval bombardment thundered in the distance, but the LST had no such firepower. It had no heavy guns, no polished armor, no sleek silhouette. It had only its mission. The flat steel hull slid forward into shallow water, engines rumbling steadily. The bow pushed onto the sand with a grinding scrape. Then the doors swung open and the ramp dropped. Once again, tanks rolled down into battle, their tracks throwing sand behind them as they pushed inland. Soldiers ran beside the vehicles, waving others forward, shouting directions as explosions thundered from the cliffs above. The enemy had expected landing craft, small wooden boats, push through surf, then retreat. But the LST was different. It brought the entire war to the beach in one unstoppable push. Not just the first wave, but the second, the third, the fourth. Everything that made an army rolled out of the LST, tank after tank, truck after truck, crate after crate. In Sicily, the Allied advance could not have moved inland without the constant stream of steel that poured from these ships. And commanders took note. The machine that would win campaigns was not the ship with the biggest guns, but the ship that delivered the most power to the shore. The next year, the Allies prepared for something far larger: the invasion of Normandy, the most ambitious amphibious assault in human history. Hundreds of thousands of men would cross the English Channel. Thousands of vehicles would land under fire. Every mile of coastline was defended by concrete bunkers and machine guns. If the first waves faltered, the entire invasion could collapse within hours. As plans were drawn during the long winter months of 1943 and 1944, one ship appeared in almost every diagram, every chart, every logistics plan: the LST. In English ports, rows of LSTs filled the docks, their blunt bows rising above the water like steel cliffs. On the tank decks, crews prepared their vehicles for the most important landing of the war. Tank crews inspected engines, gunners cleaned weapons, officers studied maps nailed to wooden boards. Soldiers lived in tight clusters inside the ship, waiting sometimes for days as weather and tides delayed the invasion. The smell of damp clothes and diesel hung in the air, but beneath it all was a sense of purpose. Every man knew that the LST was not glamorous, but without it, the invasion would be impossible. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the LSTs formed one of the most critical lines in the enormous invasion fleet. They moved slowly across the channel, pushed forward by engines that had never been designed for graceful speed, but were built for endurance. When the beaches of Normandy came into sight,
The sea was already filled with smoke, the echo of artillery and broken waves. Two of the landing sectors, Omaha and Utah, faced heavy fire. Army units pinned down needed armor reinforcement fast, and it was the LSTs that brought salvation. The first LSTs grounded themselves far up the beach, even as shells burst in the water around them. The doors swung open, and tanks surged down the ramp into the surf, drivers pushing forward despite machine gun bursts snapping across the waves. On Omaha Beach, where the fighting was worst, the LSTs became floating shields. Their tall hulls blocked lines of fire, allowing wounded men to crawl behind their steel walls. Medics ferried casualties aboard, while tanks and trucks rolled out by the dozens. The LST did everything at once. It delivered heavy armor, provided shelter, evacuated wounded, and acted as a supply lifeline through the chaos. Eisenhower later said that without the LST, the Allied armies would have drowned on the beaches of Normandy. It was not flattery, it was fact. In the days that followed D-Day, the LSTs made constant trips between England and France, carrying fuel, ammunition, reinforcements, and evacuating the wounded. Some crossed the channel twice a day. Each time their ramp slammed down onto French sand, delivering another load of strength to push inland. The Normandy invasion became a battle of logistics, and the LST was the engine that powered it. No other ship could do what the LST did. No destroyer, no transport, no carrier. Only the ugly, slow, sturdy LST with its blunt bow and steel ramp could carry the weight of an army from sea to shore and do it again and again without rest. From Sicily to Salerno, from Anzio to Normandy, the Allies learned a simple truth. Wherever victory required a beach landing, the first essential sound was not the thunder of artillery or the roar of aircraft. It was the heavy metallic crash of an LST ramp hitting sand, announcing that the next chapter of the war had begun.
By late 1944, the LST had already proven itself across the beaches of Europe, but nothing in Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, or even Normandy could prepare its crews for what waited in the Pacific. Unlike the beaches of France, where the enemy fought from bunkers, the islands of the Pacific turned every landing into a struggle against nature, terrain, and a desperate enemy willing to die rather than yield. And into this inferno of sand, coral, and volcanic ash, the LSTs sailed again and again, carrying tanks, artillery trucks, engineers, ammunition, water, fuel, bulldozers, and entire battalions directly into the teeth of Japanese fire. The Pacific did not forgive mistakes. The ocean stretched for thousands of miles, storms rose without warning, and coral reefs shredded hulls like teeth. The LST, with its flat bottom, rocked violently in rough seas, slamming into waves so hard that men were thrown from bunks at night, and equipment had to be chained down to avoid rolling into bulkheads. But the ship did what it had always done. It endured. When American planners prepared for the liberation of the Philippines, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific, they knew that victory hinged on one thing: the ability to land tanks and supplies on the beaches of Leyte without delay. The beaches were wide, but exposed. Japanese artillery and machine guns watched them, and kamikaze aircraft swarmed the skies. The LSTs moved in anyway, in long lines, low and slow shapes, sliding toward the shore under fire. Destroyers fired over their heads, battleships pounded inland positions, but none of that changed what the LST had to do. It had to hit the beach, open its bow, and unload everything inside, no matter what shells or bombs came down. As the first LSTs approached the Leyte coastline, columns of smoke rose from burning palm groves, and the sky vibrated with the distant drone of aircraft. Tanks below deck started their engines, the heat building in the enclosed steel chamber. Men stood ready on the ramp, armored crews tightening chin straps, infantry checking rifles. The bow doors opened, sunlight flooded in, and moments later, the ramp dropped with a crash. Tanks roared forward into the surf. Some immediately found themselves under fire, shells splashing into the water around them.
but the LSTs kept landing more armor, more trucks, more men. The flat bottom of the ship allowed it to beach far up the sand, giving the landing forces precious yards of progress. The Japanese fired relentlessly, and some LSTs were hit, but the ships absorbed the blows. Their thick hulls and wide compartments resisted sinking even when fires raged along their decks. Damage control teams worked in the smoke and heat, sealing holes, pumping out water, dragging hoses to stop flames on both ship and cargo. They fought not just to save the ship, but to keep the landing going. Every second mattered for the men struggling ashore. Leyte proved the LST could fight through chaos, but Iwo Jima and Okinawa pushed the ship and its crew into something far worse. Iwo Jima was a black volcanic island guarded by Japanese troops hidden deep underground. The beach was a nightmare of soft ash, rising in choking clouds as tanks tried to move forward. LST after LST grounded itself in the surf, their ramps dropping into thick waves of sand that swallowed boots and treads. Men staggered forward carrying ammunition while shells burst around them. But the LST kept coming, delivering bulldozers to carve paths, tanks to break defenses, water trucks to keep men alive, and fuel for flamethrower tanks that battled bunkers. The heat inside the tank deck grew suffocating as crews worked non-stop, sometimes for more than 20 hours without rest. The smell of sulfur from the island mixed with diesel and cordite, drifting inside the ship as the battle raged just yards from the ramp. Some LSTs were hit by mortar fire, others struck mines hidden beneath the surf. One took a direct hit from a shore gun, shattering part of the bow. But even then, the crew pushed on, unloading every last vehicle before backing away into deeper water, scarred but afloat. And then came Okinawa, the bloodiest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. The seas around the island became a graveyard of ships. Japanese kamikaze pilots hurled themselves at anything that floated, and the LST, with its huge silhouette and slow engines, was a perfect target. Crews watched enemy aircraft dive from the clouds, engines screaming, the rising hum of death aimed directly at them. Anti-aircraft guns roared, but the LSTs had few heavy weapons to defend themselves. Some were struck, the explosions ripping open superstructures and scattering debris across the tank deck. Fires erupted instantly, smoke choking passageways. Tanks inside were splashed with burning fuel, but damage control teams acted with the discipline earned from years of training. They flooded compartments, shifted ballast, and fought fires with hoses and foam, even as explosions rocked the ship. Their job was simple: keep the LST alive long enough to finish the mission. Some LSTs burned for hours, but still managed to lower ramps and unload tanks and trucks before sinking. Others made it back to sea with their decks blackened and twisted, but still operational. The reason was simple. The LST's design allowed it to survive punishment that would sink other vessels. Its enormous cargo hold could absorb blasts without catastrophic flooding, its flat bottom helped prevent capsizing, and its crew drilled relentlessly for every nightmare the Pacific could deliver. The island battles of the Pacific taught the world a brutal lesson. Tanks and artillery could win ground, planes could strike targets, ships could bombard from offshore, but none of it mattered without the LST. The ship was the hinge on which every landing turned. Without its ramp hitting the sand, the invasion could not advance. Without its cargo pouring onto the beach, the foothold would collapse. And without its endurance in the face of shellfire, mines, and kamikaze, the Pacific War would have stretched on far longer. Every island from Leyte to Okinawa was conquered on steel tracks and boots that came down the ramp of an LST. Slow, awkward, and uncelebrated, the ship did not simply deliver armies, it delivered the momentum that shattered the Empire of Japan, one beach at a time.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, and American forces stepped back from the last brutal landings of the Pacific, the great fleets that had carried them to victory began returning home. The carriers returned in triumph, the battleships in thunderous pride, the destroyers with stories of daring duels and night battles. But the LST returned quietly, slipping into port without ceremony, carrying dents, scorched marks, rust, and memories instead of glory. It had done its job again and again and again.
Yet almost no one, beyond the men who served on them, understood that victory itself had ridden ashore within the steel belly of these strange ships. For the sailors and soldiers who knew the LST intimately, the end of the war brought a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that the endless surf landings were over, that no more kamikazes screamed out of the clouds, that no more tank decks would fill with smoke and shouting. But sorrow too, because this ship, which had carried them across 3 years of war, felt like more than a vessel. It felt like a companion, a workhorse, a guardian that had taken every blow so its passengers could fight on land instead of drowning at sea. As the surviving LSTs returned to bases across the Pacific and Atlantic, crews stepped off their gangways and looked back one last time at the squat steel bow, the heavy ramp, and the long, flat deck. They remembered the first time they had seen the ship and laughed at its appearance, the long, slow target, the ugly duckling, the floating barn. They remembered how wrong they had been. Some ships came home with obvious scars. Twisted steel along the bow where shore guns had struck, blackened streaks across the deck from fires, coral scrapes along the hull from reef landings. A few returned missing sections of their superstructure, hit by kamikazes that failed to sink them, but could not erase the cratered marks of desperate battles inside the tank decks where gouges from shrapnel, dents from explosions, and scorch marks painted over hastily by crews who did not have time to rest before the next landing. Yet each ship carried something more important than scars. It carried history. Every campaign, from Torch to Sicily, from Salerno to Normandy, from Leyte to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, bore the imprint of the LST. Without these ships, the tanks, dozers, ammunition crates, fuel drums, and soldiers that won the land battle would never have reached the shore. Eisenhower himself understood this truth, and decades later he said plainly, "Without the LSTs, we could not have won the war." It was an acknowledgement rare among great commanders, because he knew that victory had not belonged solely to the glamorous machines of war. The glory had been earned by the ship that spent the war with its bow in the sand and its belly full of the weight of armies. After the war, hundreds of LSTs were decommissioned quietly. Some were sold for scrap, cut apart into steel plates by workers who never knew how many lives the ship had carried. Some were converted into ferries, cargo vessels, fishing boats, or support ships. A few were sold to Allied navies, where they continued to serve into the 1960s and 1970s, unchanged except for new paint. A small handful survived long enough to become museum ships. But even then, most visitors walked past them without understanding that the ramp they stood on was once the threshold between life and death for thousands of men. The sailors who had served aboard LSTs grew older, collecting medals perhaps, but rarely the recognition they deserved. At reunions, men who had stormed beaches in Sherman tanks would find themselves thanking the quiet sailors who had delivered them safely ashore. Those sailors would smile and shrug and say something modest, like, "just doing our job." But they all knew the truth. The LST had carried the war on its back, and the men inside its steel hull had carried its soul. In quiet moments, decades later, some veterans would touch the steel ramp of a preserved LST and remember the sound it made when it crashed onto sand, that heavy iron thud that announced the start of battle. They would remember the chaos of the tank deck, engines roaring as vehicles surged forward, the smell of burned rubber and hot steel drifting in from the shore, the shouts of officers coordinating the next wave. They would remember nights on rough seas when the ship rolled so violently they tied themselves into bunks, the deck tilting at angles that would break lesser ships. They would remember Okinawa, when clouds of smoke blackened the horizon and the sky burned with the light of kamikaze flames, and still the LSTs pressed on, because the men on the beach needed them, because the war needed them, because the world needed them. And in those memories, the veterans understood something profound. The LST had not been built for glory. It had been built for necessity, for endurance, for service. It did not fight with guns, but with delivery, with presence, with sheer unstoppable purpose. It brought armies to the battlefield and then returned for more, carrying the wounded away and hope forward. As the years passed, the LST slipped quietly into history, its name overshadowed by legends with bigger guns and louder stories. But the truth remained clear. Behind every Allied landing, behind every beachhead, behind every advance stood the unglamorous, tireless LST, the ship that made victory possible, but never claimed the triumph for itself. The war could not have been won without it, and yet it never asked the world to remember it. Only the men who served aboard it did, and they knew that on every shoreline where freedom returned, the first footprint was made possible by a ship that never sought glory, but delivered victory all the same.